Last time we spoke about the Red Army on the run. In the second week of Operation Barbarossa, the progress of the German forces was marked by swift victories and severe challenges. The Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies led to significant destruction of Soviet aircraft, with Germany claiming thousands down. However, the Soviet Air Force with hidden reserves began to regroup under General Timoshenko, setting the stage for resilience. Amidst the chaotic battlefields, disorganization plagued the Red Army, which struggled to adapt its tactics against the more cohesive German forces. Despite losing heavily, Soviet commanders sought to turn the tide, but logistical issues and fierce German assaults exacerbated their plight. As the Germans captured crucial territories like Riga, their strategic goal conflicted with rising concerns from within their command. While Adolf Hitler believed victory was within reach, generals like Halder worried they were overestimating the Soviet strength. The relentless advances led to a fierce fighting at the edges of Smolensk, where both armies braced for the inevitable and consequential clash. This episode is the beginning of the Battle of Smolensk. Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Eastern Front podcast week by week. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more. Let's go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, my personal podcast found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, I've just released a 4-part series covering the best and worst generals, admirals, and air marshals of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 27 episodes and ongoing, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Well, hello there and welcome back. It's week 3 of Operation Barbarossa. On July the 8th, Army Group Center officially proclaimed that it had captured 287,704 prisoners, destroyed or seized at least 2,585 tanks, and taken about 1,449 guns. While these numbers do reflect considerable gains, they do not necessarily indicate that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. In fact, the opposite was true. As the German offensive strength began to wane, the Soviet Union was implementing one of the most remarkable mobilization programs in military history. Throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, the Red Army had developed a cadre system, maintaining a small number of active-duty soldiers in peacetime that could be rapidly expanded by reservists during wartime. This system received a boost with the 1938 Universal Military Service Law, which extended the age of enlistment for the Army Reserves to 50 and established numerous military schools to accommodate the influx of recruits. By the time of the German invasion, the Red Army boasted a mobilization base of about 14 million men. By the end of June of 1941, 5.3 million reservists had been called up, with subsequent mobilizations continuing to swell the ranks. This cadre system allowed for an unprecedented rate of force generation, catching German intelligence completely off guard and concealing the true strength of the Soviet military. In July of 1941, an outstanding 13 new field armies emerged, followed by another 14 in August. While these reserve armies were not as well equipped or trained as their professional counterparts, as the German mobile forces weakened, many of the front lines began to settle into positional warfare. This shift granted new armies the time they needed to improve. While it would be unreasonable to downplay the magnitude of the Western Front's military disaster in Belarus, it is important to recognize that the Soviet Union's system for generating forces allowed it to quickly replace losses and expand the size of the Red Army. To give you further figures, on June the 22nd of 1941, the Red Army counted about 5,373,000 men. By August the 31st, despite these heavy losses, the number had surged to nearly 7 million, and by December of the 31st of 1941, it reached an estimated 8 million. After the war, German military officer Blumentritt acknowledged the fundamental issue of latent Soviet military strength. He recalled the German offensive plans aimed at encircling and destroying the Red Army before reaching the Dnieper and Dvina rivers, ultimately asking, "But what if armies, millions strong, had not yet been mobilized, and only parts of the Red Army were in western Russia?" The loss of tanks heavily weighed on the Soviets, as these assets were much harder to replace. However, historians have often overstated the extent of German victories, particularly regarding the Soviet tank fleet. At the war's offset, the Soviets had an astonishing total of 23,767 tanks, but this figure included many that were already obsolete. Around 15,000 of those were the older T-26 and BT models, most of which were in need of repair. Compounding the issue, untrained crews faced a severe shortage of ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and critical support, such as air cover. It's little wonder that Soviet tanks often sat abandoned on the battlefield, if they even made it that far. Thus, the seemingly impressive numbers of Soviet tanks destroyed can be better understood as a disaster waiting to happen. Ineffective Soviet planning and direction significantly contributed to what became the Germans' first major triumph, inflating the narrative of an overwhelming victory through the sheer volume of outdated equipment. However, what proved vital for the future of the war was the production of new tanks. In this regard, Soviet leadership demonstrated impressive resolve. As the powerful German war machine charged eastward, another kind of battle raged behind the Soviet lines, a battle not fought with tanks or rifles, but with wrenches, train cars, and sheer determination. Entire factories were uprooted and transported east, beyond the towering Ural Mountains, in a frantic race against the relentless advance of the enemy. As the Wehrmacht relentlessly pushed towards Smolensk and Leningrad, the Soviets are embarking on an extraordinary industrial mobilization, one of the most staggering efforts in military history. What was unfolding was nothing short of remarkable: the relocation of hundreds of Soviet factories from the devastated Western Front to the safer haven east of the Urals. It had begun on June the 24th when a dedicated committee sprang into action, tasked with the monumental challenge of evacuation. By the first week of July, the effort was in full swing and rapidly gaining momentum as the month progressed. This evacuation would stretch on until December of 1941, and its importance cannot be overstated. The survival of the Red Army depended upon it. As the field forces suffered staggering losses of equipment, the situation grew even graver. Much of the stockpile was outdated, a relic of a bygone era. Modern war machines were rolling off assembly lines, but they were being deployed to the front lines faster than they could be replenished. Just last week, we witnessed the KV-1 tanks being dispatched directly from factories to participate in the fierce assaults. The emergency deployment of arms and ammunition to frontline units would continue throughout the war, but to sustain this momentum, the factories had to be relocated. And while the Lend-Lease equipment would only begin arriving in significant numbers in 1942, the Soviets were determined not to lose ground. Their resolve, ingenuity, and relentless spirit would be tested like never before in this pivotal moment of history. Thus, it was decided the entire factories would be dismantled, sometimes down to the wiring, carefully packed, and transported eastward. This monumental task was anything but easy. Surprisingly, the Germans appeared largely unaware of what was unfolding, showing little effort to disrupt the evacuation. Yet even without German interference, the process of dismantling, moving, and reassembling the industrial base presented staggering challenges. The invasion itself turned this effort into a Herculean task, fraught with difficulties. Many factories arrived at their new locations incomplete, delayed, misplaced, and in some cases, all three. Throughout most of 1941, the fighting was carried out with weapons that had already been produced. However, one must wonder how much would the Red Army's rebuilding efforts for the 1942 campaigns hinge on the output from these relocated factories in 1941. Not everything necessary for the war effort could be evacuated. Crucial infrastructure, like mines, roads, and dams, had to be abandoned. In many cases, Soviet forces resorted to sabotage, deliberately undermining these assets to prevent them from falling into the enemy hands. Perhaps most famous of these acts of sabotage by the retreating Soviets was the destruction of the dam at Zaporozhye in August of 1941. The result flood may have killed an upwards of 100,000 people. This was no trivial matter. Sabotage often came at a steep cost, claiming lives and destroying years of hard work by countless men and women who had toiled during the 5-year plans. Yet despite the risks, Stalin and his inner circle understood that this grim decision was essential for the survival of their war effort. Between July and November, 1,523 industrial enterprises moved to the Volga region, Siberia, or Central Asia, totaling about 1.5 million railway wagon loads. Even more astonishing, production of the essential war materials actually increased during the later half of 1941, with some official production quotas, particularly for tanks, being exceeded. In fact, the Soviet Union produced more tanks in 1941 than Germany did, with 66% of these being the newer T-34 and KV-1 models. The Soviets also manufactured more aircraft and artillery pieces than Germany, effectively meeting the immediate needs of their armed forces. When evaluating the outcome of Germany's first significant offensive on the Eastern Front, it becomes clear that the German military leadership overestimated how their victories would impact the Soviet Union's ability to maintain a cohesive front. They failed to recognize the necessity of balancing the tighter perimeter around their encircled forces with the need for a rapid continuation of their advance to capitalize on their success. The root of this problem became evident early on in the war. The Germans lacked sufficient mobile forces to achieve their objectives. Consequently, as losses mounted and the campaign ventured into ambitious new territories, the specter of overextension loomed large. Meanwhile, as Guderian and Hoth were mapping out the next phase of their operations, Blaric hosted an important meeting at his home, attended by Adolf Hitler, Halder, and Huizinga. Halder opened the session with a summary of current operations, after which Hitler expressed his strong beliefs in the necessity of securing the Gulf of Finland, emphasizing the need to eliminate the Soviet fleet's threat to ore shipments. In a notable shift from his previous assertiveness, Halder recorded that Hitler seemed unsure about whether additional panzer forces would be needed to be allocated by Bock for the rapid capture of Leningrad. It's possible that under the pressure from Halder and Blaric, who may have praised the successes of Lebe's advances, Hitler felt compelled to hesitate about diverting strength from Army Group Center. The positive reports from that front left Hitler in high spirits, given Huizinga the impression that he could speak freely with him, even sharing ideas that might typically be unwelcome. Aside from discussing northern operations, Hitler highlighted the strategic significance of Ukraine for its food and industrial potential, underscoring the economic motivations behind his military strategy. However, Halder's diary, the only surviving record of the meeting, reveals that Hitler did not seem to consider diverting Bock's panzers to the south at this time. He viewed the advance on Moscow as a secondary priority, suggesting that it could only be undertaken by infantry units, at the earliest maybe in August, once Smolensk had been secured. In Hitler's mind, he would not commit armored forces to support the infantry's drive towards Moscow until the northern front had been adequately addressed. Ultimately, the future role of Army Group Center remained uncertain even after the meeting on June the 30th, and it would not be conclusively determined until Smolensk fell into German hands. As the battle for Smolensk commenced, the Luftwaffe struggled with dwindling numbers of aircraft, tasked with covering an ever-expanding front line. The reduction of the encircled pockets at Minsk and Bialystok had only been achieved through the intense commitment of Luftwaffe resources. This heavy reliance resulted in wear and tear on the planes, hampering more comprehensive efforts to support the encirclement at Smolensk. Moreover, establishing and maintaining supply routes became increasingly challenging for many units of the 2nd Air Corps, which was responsible for supporting the southern flank of Army Group Center. These logistical issues allowed the Soviet Air Force, or the Военно-Воздушные Силы, which we will call the VVS, to exploit gaps in the Luftwaffe's protective coverage. The Soviet Il-2 bombers launched raids that created significant headaches for the German air. With an ever-growing number of Soviet fighters joining the fray, the Soviets were far from ready to surrender control of the skies, even after suffering staggering losses in June. Army Group North was fully engaged in its push towards Leningrad. The Red Army launched an armored counterattack at Ostrov against General Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps, but ultimately failed to drive them back. In the wake of the setback, desperation began to set in as the Northwestern Front sought to establish a new defensive position at Luga, just 140 kilometers southwest of Leningrad. Meanwhile, General Manstein's 56th Panzer Corps found itself bogged down in some swampy woods, struggling to cover the largely unprotected stretch between Ostrov and Luga. He arrived in Ostrov 5 days after Reinhardt, and, to delay that, while not catastrophic, was beginning to create complications. By July the 10th, Manstein finally reached Porkov, around 90 kilometers past Ostrov. On that same day, Reinhardt arrived at Luga, another 100 kilometers further down the road. The growing gap between their forces was becoming increasingly perilous, but Manstein was determined to close it. To outflank the Soviets at Luga, he pushed his forces towards Srotsy. However, the first assault by the 1st Panzer Division at Luga met fierce resistance and it was halted. In response, Reinhardt orchestrated a wide flanking maneuver with the 6th Panzer Division to the west. This approach was consistent with the standard tactics favored by panzer commanders, who often achieved remarkable victories, from Sedan to Minsk, but opted for the encirclement instead of direct assaults. There was one major issue. In the forests and marshes of the Baltic region, where the landscape was dotted with lakes and small rivers, the panzers lacked the speed necessary for effective envelopment. Reinhardt managed to establish a small bridgehead at Luga, but this required an entire week of intense fighting. And during this time, the Soviets capitalized on the slow progress of the Germans. The Northwestern Front repositioned significant forces, led by the 70th Rifle Division, on either side of Manstein's stretched lines, as he struggled to march to Solce. A trap was being set for the following week, aimed at crushing the leading edge of the 56th Panzer Corps. On July the 13th, the 8th Panzer Division finally arrived at Solce, and it was here that the trap would be sprung. Vatutin, now serving as the Chief of Staff of the Northwestern Front, was prepared to direct the battle. The tables had turned. It was now the panzers that found themselves desperately trying to break free from a pocket. Hopna would need to intervene to save Manstein from potential disaster, redirecting some of his forces away from the advance on Luga to assist him in this critical moment. As Army Group North unwittingly led its panzers deep into the Baltic forests and into a carefully laid trap, Army Group Center was gearing up for a fight at Smolensk. July the 10th is often marked as the official start of this battle. Battles rarely conform to the neat definitions of time and space, especially in context of industrial-scale conflicts. The timestamps we attach to the beginning and the ending of battles are necessarily arbitrary. Throughout this podcast, we will emphasize this point while still acknowledging the most commonly accepted dates and locations for various battles. But as you can imagine, the Eastern Front is extremely complicated. It's important to remember that the fighting within a battle cannot be confined to the times or the places we're even mentioning. When battles involve hundreds of thousands of troops and span thousands of square miles over days or weeks, they can't be adequately captured by single labels like the Battle of X. This terminology implies a level of neatness that fails to reflect the complexity and the chaos of real warfare. The counterattacks launched by Timoshenko's Western Front the previous week were crucial. They aimed to buy him some more time needed to assemble his forces to resist the Germans at Smolensk. While these counterattacks failed to push the panzers back, they were still successes in that they allowed him more vital, fresh troops into position. However, none of these efforts proved sufficient. Not the fresh divisions, nor the time, nor the space would be enough to turn the tide. On the morning of July the 9th, the 20th Panzer Division launched a decisive strike across the Dvina River. Their attack was a textbook example of armored warfare, quickly demolishing the Soviet infantry of the 62nd Rifle Corps from the 22nd Army. By nightfall, the panzers had reached Vitebsk, covering an impressive 60 kilometers while breaking through well-prepared Soviet defenses. This remarkable advance echoed the earlier days of the war and seemed to dispel any doubts that the offensive capabilities of the Wehrmacht panzer forces were anything but great. However, this perception was misleading, as the declining numbers of available tanks and trucks told a different story. Yet many leaders within the Wehrmacht allowed themselves to be blinded by the string of victories, beliefs that would soon be put to the test. For the time being, the Wehrmacht remained in a position of dominance, leaving Timoshenko reeling from the unexpected assault that easily disrupted his preparedness. In response, he clumsily committed the remainder of the 5th and 7th Mechanized Corps to the fight. Unfortunately for him, these forces were brushed aside with ease. In less than a week, Timoshenko had lost a significant portion of his armored reserves, more than 800 tanks, a catastrophic blow, and the assault against his lines were just beginning. Meanwhile, in front of Guderian's panzer group, the Soviet 13th Army struggled. Still battered from the encirclement at Minsk, the 13th had not received any significant reinforcements. Once they crossed the river in force, they drove straight towards the heart of Smolensk. Timoshenko faced encirclement from both sides, just as his unfortunate predecessor had experienced at Minsk and Bialystok only 2 weeks earlier. Although the 20th Army still held the line between Smolensk and Orsha, this position was rapidly becoming irrelevant as the panzers advanced further east, outflanking these defenses to the north and south. In many respects, the first 10 days of July 1941 represented a race towards the Dvina and Dnieper rivers, as both Bok and Timoshenko endeavored to amass sufficient forces to confront each other. The swift collapse of the Soviet Western Front in June, coupled with the chaos amongst Timoshenko's scattered and makeshift troops, placed him at a disadvantage in the race. However, the German blitzkrieg was also losing its momentum. A major impediment for the Germans was the condition of the Soviet roads, which inflicted more damage on their panzers and motorized divisions than the Red Army. To bolster the German advance into the Soviet Union, a significant number of civilian vehicles, trucks, and cars were commandeered to supplement the Army's lack of motorization. Unfortunately, these vehicles often lack the ground clearance needed for such treacherous conditions, leading them to bottom out on the rugged and uneven roads. This caused considerable damage to their transmissions and oil sumps. Additionally, the weaker suspension system of civilian vehicles frequently just broke, leaving a trail of wreckage in the wake of the German advance. Military vehicles were not spared either. Alexander Kors, serving with a panzer division, vividly described the perilous roads his unit encountered on July the 5th. He noted, "Very bad roads, full of holes." He wrote in his diary later, "Some vehicles tipped over, luckily, none in our company. After 18 kilometers of marching, I sat on an armored vehicle that tipped so much it balanced on 2 wheels while the other 2 lifted off the ground. Miraculously, it did not topple over. Along the way, there was a moor that forced the vehicle to take a long detour. One by one, they got stuck or even overturned, leading to breakdowns at a slow pace." On July the 6th, General Halinek, who commanded 3 infantry divisions, expressed his frustrations in a letter to his wife. "The compression of troops onto narrow avenues of advance makes progress slower than we would like. To this, we must add to the dreadful roads that exacerbate the difficulties. Lord God, this is a primitive land north of the Pripyat marshes, forests everywhere, interspersed with kilometer-wide swamps where one can sink up to the knee." In addition to the inhospitable terrain, vast distances, terrible roads, worsening weather emerged as a significant obstacle for the advancing German forces. Following heavy rainfall, a report from Kluge's 4th Panzer Army on July the 6th indicated that the roads across the expansive Beresina swamplands from the west of Minsk to the Dnieper were, quote, "exceptionally bad and often bottomless." The report noted that motorized units were being greatly slowed and urgently required more engineers and construction resources. As Hans von Luck from the 7th Panzer Division described, "After brief downpours, the roads transformed into muddy tracks that were only passable at certain points, often requiring engineers or offloaded grenadiers to fell trees to create makeshift wooden pathways. Ultimately, it was not just the enemy that hindered the advance. The catastrophic state of the roads played a significant role." Feldmarschall Kesselring, commander of the Army Group Center, Air Fleet No. 2, noted that the intermittent rain worsened the already primitive roads, revealing the true face of the Russian theater. He summed up the logistical challenges in the east, concluding that even fully tracked vehicles, including tanks and the supply services, largely depended on the arterial roads, which aided troops by providing warnings about impending difficulties. On July the 7th, Bock added, "It has been raining for 2 days on the 4th Panzer Army. This has made the road conditions dreadful and placed an extraordinary strain on both men and materials." At one point, the sunken roads forced the 7th Panzer Division to struggle for 2 days to advance just 90 kilometers, while the summer downpours turned many roads into swamps. Elsewhere, the thick mud quickly reverted to the Army's other significant hindrance, dust. On July the 6th, Wilhelm Prüller noted in his diary, "The advance is proceeding very slowly. Numerous obstacles are hindering our progress. You can hardly call what we're on a road. It's better than this in the smallest hamlet in Germany. And we're marching on a main road. The shoulders of the road are muddy from the previous rain sinking up to our knees, but in the center, there's already dust. Each vehicle is engulfed in impenetrable clouds of dust." This rather remarkable scene was echoed by the 4th Panzer Army's Chief of Staff, Major General Gunther Blumentritt, who would later write, "A vivid picture that remains from those initial weeks is the massive clouds of yellow dust. The heat was intense, interspersed with sudden showers that quickly turned the roads to mud before the sun reappeared, baking them back into crumbling clay." On just the 2nd day of the war, the commander of the 43rd Army's Corps remarked, "Every step and every vehicle creates an impenetrable cloud of dust. The march routes are marked by a yellowish-brown cloud that lingers in the air like a mist." For men, machines, and animals, the dust became a torment for the German advance. Ironically, the very roads crucial to the rapid German blitzkrieg were also a primary factor in slowing their progress eastward. One soldier described the exhausting summer advance as such, Our feet sank into the sand and dirt, sending dust into the air that clung to us. The horses coughed in the dust, creating a pungent smell. The loose sand was almost as tiring for the horses as the deep mud would have been. The men marched in silence, covered in dust, with parched throats and lips. In the early days of the campaign, the first dust of the Soviet Union proved deadlier to the German panzer and motorized divisions than the Red Army's counterattacks. Said dust quickly overwhelmed the inadequate air filters, infiltrating the engines, and initially increased oil consumption, ultimately rendering many engines unusable. Despite its dangers, the dust remained pervasive and unavoidable. Klaus Hansmann wrote that his motorized column drove as if in a sandstorm. The wheels churned up fountains of sand and obscured the sun. The dust burned our noses and throats. As a result, the rate of the vehicle failure began to rise alarmingly. In Guderin's panzer group, estimates of combat-ready tanks varied widely but indicated a significant attrition rate that severely reduced force strength. The most optimistic assessment, recorded on July the 7th, noted that the tanks in the 18th and 3rd Panzer Divisions were just at 35% combat readiness, while the 4th and 17th Panzer Divisions were at 60%, and the 10th Panzer Division was the strongest at 80%. However, contrasting figures from the quartermaster's diary indicated that the 18th Panzer Division was only at 25% strength, and the 17th at 50%. Just 2 days earlier, the war diary of the 47th Panzer Corps, which included both divisions, reported the 18th Panzer Division at 30% strength and the 17th at 33% of its initial total. Clearly, there was a confusion regarding the precise figures, likely due to differing definitions of what constituted as combat readiness. Nevertheless, it is evident that the first 2 weeks of operations took a toll on the German panzers. Undoubtedly, the poor roads and pervasive dust accounted for most of the high failure rates, although reports indicated that using captured Soviet low-octane fuel also significantly damaged German engines, contributing to losses. Timoshenko struggled to gather reinforcements to counter the German spearheads, but two major factors hindered their effective deployment. First, Timoshenko failed to wait for a strong force to be assembled. Instead, incomplete tank divisions and rifle corps arrived from trains or road marches and launched attacks before they could even properly organize. These assaults lacked coordination and were no match for the well-structured German units. The second issue was Timoshenko's poor intelligence regarding the positions and intentions of the panzers. The German army on the Eastern Front was starting to undergo a process that author David Stahel refers to as demodernization. During the battle at Smolensk, the panzer divisions were still capable of functioning as well-oiled combined arms teams, but this was reliant on the stockpile of spare parts and fuel that Army Group Center had been able to assemble for the push. This was one of the last times that any of the army groups was able to facilitate a large-scale offensive before the end of the year. However, this demodernization meant only that the units were regressing to an earlier stage of tactical mobility, in the absence of trucks and tanks. It did not mean that they could not still beat their unorganized Soviet counterparts. This problem was not unique to the Battle of Smolensk. It plagued the Red Army throughout Operation Barbarossa. Due to inadequate tactical intelligence, Timoshenko missed opportunities to isolate and destroy the panzers. As a result, he often marched his troops deeper into developing pockets rather than cutting off the spearheads of the panzer groups. On July 12th, Zhukov sent an order from the Stavka to Timoshenko, directing him to initiate a counteroffensive with all available land and air forces. Timoshenko complied, launching the largest counteroffensive of the war up to that point, sending 6 armies into battle. One of his primary objectives was to relieve the encircled 13th Army at Mokhilov. While this goal was not achieved, the distraction did allow some units of the beleaguered 13th Army to make it back to the Soviet lines. There was a few minor successes during the offensive. The 63rd Rifle Corps under the 4th Army managed to push back elements of the 43rd Infantry Corps in the area around Rogatchov, a critical crossing point on the Dnipro River. However, this victory was short-lived, as the infantry of the 63rd Rifle found themselves exposed to the failure of the surrounding attacks on their flanks. Other instances of squandered success appeared throughout the front. Colonel General Korodnikov had a 3-division horse cavalry group that broke out behind German lines around the same time, wreaking havoc on supply lines. However, this impact was less significant than it could have been, likely due to hesitancy about becoming cut off in the rapidly evolving situation. Meanwhile, Guderin paid little heed to these attacks, focusing instead on his drive to encircle Smolensk. Though maybe surprising to some, the Red Army employed cavalry throughout the war in large formations. This was partially because of the strong influence of old cavalry officers at the top of the Red Army's hierarchy. Budonny and Timoshenko had both been longtime cavalrymen in the Russian Civil War and preached its continuing place on the modern battlefield. They both faced criticism for the stance, but eventually they were proven right to some degree. No doubt helpful to their cause was the fact that Stalin had also served in a cavalry unit himself, where he first made the acquaintance of the two marshals. The fighting was far from over. The scale of the conflict meant that a resolution could not be achieved within a week. By July the 14th, the situation had become quite dire, but the fate of the Western Front was not yet sealed. Timoshenko still had an opportunity to save his men, if not Smolensk itself. Now, over on the southwestern and southern fronts, the situation was equally challenging for the Red Army. Kleist's panzers had been split up, pursuing two divergent objectives. The 11th and 13th Panzer Divisions faced counterattacks from the 4th, 9th, 19th, and 22nd Mechanized Corps in front of Kiev. Although the southwestern front remained strong, its forces were stretched thinly across the western parts of Ukraine. These mechanized forces represented Kurbanov's last chance to blunt the panzer's advance towards Kiev. While the southwestern front was launching its final armored reserves at the panzers outside Kiev, Lieutenant General Potapov was pulling the Fifth Army back from positions at Korostin. Under Kurbanov's orders, Potapov aimed to strike from the north, while Lieutenant General Muzichenko's Sixth Army was tasked with attacking from the south. Together with the Mechanized Corps in the center, these armies hoped to rescue the trapped 7th Rifle Corps and ideally cut off Kleist's spearhead heading towards Kiev. Unfortunately, this goal was quite beyond their reach, and all they managed was to delay the panzers at great cost. By July 13th, the 4 Mechanized Corps had dwindled to just 95 tanks. On the opening days of Operation Barbarossa, these corps had possessed over 2,300 tanks. Despite the losses suffered by the Germans, it was hard to see anything but a near-total victory for the Wehrmacht in the first 3 weeks of fighting in Ukraine. However, the fighting in front of Kiev did not manage to delay the panzers long enough to convince Hitler that they could not take Kiev on their own. He reversed his earlier order that Kleist should take Kiev while simultaneously completing the southern encirclement of Uman. His new directive was to finish the encirclement first, then turn the entire army group to capture Kiev. This was essentially a reversal, a tacit admission that he had urged just days after issuing orders to Kleist. Operation Barbarossa was always conducted with political pressures from Hitler and his inner circle at the forefront in the minds of his generals. Halder, Rundstedt, Bock, and Leber, the highest-ranking officers in the army, battled with each other and Hitler constantly over the direction of the campaign. The lower tiers of commanders were not immune to this either, as we shall see in a few weeks with Guderian. It was becoming clear that Army Group South was unable to seize Kiev and destroy the Red Army around Uman simultaneously. Even the task of cutting off the Soviet forces in the area was proving quite difficult. Choosing to focus on closing the pocket at Uman rather than the location further east was a compromise, reflecting the actual combat power Army Group South could muster. These deliberations continued throughout the week with the attack date set for July 15th. In the meantime, Hitler increasingly assumed the role of Army Group Commander, shuffling individual divisions at the front. At this stage of the war, logistics underpinned every German plan. The General Staff recognized early on that the existing Russian railway lines would need to be converted to standard European gauge. Initially, there were unfounded hopes that a quick strike across the border would allow for the seizure of significant amounts of Russian rolling stock, which would mitigate the need for immediate rail conversion. Rolling stock refers to all of the vehicles that move already on those tracks, including both powered and underpowered ones. This encompasses locomotives, passenger and freight cars, and various other railway equipment like snowplows. However, this did not materialize. In the absence of necessary rolling stock, the gauge conversion process began. But this was not quick, even under the best conditions. The railroad troops assigned to the conversion were undermanned, poorly protected, and lacking in resources. Changing the gauge and rail lines is an involved process that is not done well by amateurs. As skilled workers were killed or died from the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front, there were few replacements from the home front. The process revolves around pulling the track spikes, lifting the rails, and relaying them to a desired gauge, then driving the spikes right back in. It is quite hard labor even if only one rail is moving when narrowing the gauge. Moreover, they faced conflicting demands from the commanders at the front and the long-term construction priorities set by the Quartermaster General, that being General Wagner. Wagner required these troops to focus on building high-capacity railway lines behind each army group, which involved more than just regauging the tracks. Essential infrastructure such as switching yards, turnabouts, signals, and all that had to be constructed to establish proper high-capacity lines. Additionally, many of the existing track routes were subpar. Even those tracks that could be easily regauged were often poorly engineered and poorly installed, significantly lowering their carrying capacity. This entire process was labor-intensive and required careful allocation of men and materials to succeed. General Wagner was tasked with this challenge because it was his responsibility to ensure that field forces received the supplies they needed, facilitating the construction of large supply dumps that could serve as buffers against the demands of the armies. The other side of the rail debate was the urgent need for the field forces to have the tracks regauged as quickly as possible. This would reduce the demand on their limited truck transport capabilities and enable them to redeploy via rail, which was far easier for both the men and equipment than marching. Unfortunately for the Wehrmacht in the east, there simply wasn't enough rail troops available to meet this demand. As a result, neither mission was accomplished to the satisfaction of any party involved, and the logistics of the Wehrmacht continued to suffer. From the war's opening days, the strategic reserves of fuel were already quite low, and a lack of other critical resources was impacting production. As the conflict dragged on, fuel became an immediate concern for field commanders. Some of the shortage was due to production shortfalls. There is much to be said about the war economy in Germany, if it ever truly existed. Alternatives to petroleum-based fuels were explored, but these required other resources that were also scarce. Steel, coal, and labor were not plentiful, as production was falling in many areas of Europe. However, even more critical for panzers was the sharp decline in fuel deliveries as they advanced further and further from Germany. The logistics apparatus simply could not keep pace with the demands of the front lines. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Hey, if you want to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 27 episodes and ongoing at this point, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, but the Red Army, under General Timoshenko, rallied despite heavy losses. A remarkable mobilization program saw millions of reservists called up, even as factories relocated eastward to evade German forces. As armored clashes erupted, Stalin's leadership shone through, but logistical challenges loomed quite large. Timoshenko's forces faced a desperate struggle, launching counteroffensives amidst fierce battles. The fate of Smolensk hung precariously as both sides braced for the inevitable, a crucial confrontation in this brutal conflict.